For today's topic, our last just an hour of the semester of the academic year. Can't believe how quickly that went by. But it's been great, and we hope to continue this in fall. But for today, we invited colleagues to share some of the diverse and innovative approaches that they use in their scholarship to create and share knowledge. And I think and we think that this may be an especially timely topic given the recent focus on revising the standards of academia to be more inclusive of varied forms of knowledge creation and dissemination, as well as new digital tools and media that are increasingly available to us to disseminate the work that we do. As Betty said, Amanda can't join us today, but we do have Keon McGuire, Sherman, Dorn, and Brian Nelson joining us today. So thank you to the three of them for taking time to be here with us. And we look forward to sort of a wide conversation around this. So let me just start off with Keon and, in turn, Keon, Sherman, and Brian, to just introduce yourself and the focus of your research and scholarship. And we will start from there and then go around talking a little bit more about what non-traditional, and I put air quotes there, media or approaches that you've been using. So Keon, let's start with you.
Sure. Thank you, Punya, and thank you, Betty and Claren, for organizing this invitation. So Keon McGuire, my pronouns are he, him, his. I'm an associate professor in the higher and post-secondary education program. The way I describe my work is I draw on Africana study frameworks to look at race, religion, and gender, largely among Black undergraduate and graduate students attending historically white institutions. But I'm also interested in how heteronormativity, patriarchy, and white supremacy undermine students' experiences of inclusion and belonging on college and university campuses. I'll pass it to Sherman.
All right, thank you. I am an historian of education policy in the U.S. Since 1945. I'm actually going to put some of my projects in chat because I want to talk a little bit about why I've explored other channels of communication. My advisor, Michael Katz, believed deeply in the relevance of history for contemporary debates. You can see it in almost all of his writings. And early on in my career, I had some experience with engaging conversations in email listservs, including one Gene Glass created when he was here as a faculty member on education policy.
Brian?
Hi there, I'm Brian Nelson, and I guess I'm in the LLT program mostly. I have two main areas of research. The one that has been the main focus over the 18 years or so that I've been here is on bringing together learning sciences, sort of understanding of what we know about how people learn, combining that with the design of emerging technologies to help support STEM learning mostly. I've done a lot of projects involving simulations and digital games and other kinds of immersive environments. And then a second area of my research more recently is around computational thinking integrated into science classes. I'm doing a grant right now where we're focused on bringing culturally relevant experiences to students in Washington, D.C., Maryland, and in districts in Phoenix into elementary school, working with teachers there. And I'll put a little link to my website that describes some of the projects I've been working on.
Thank you, Brian. And since we're with you, Brian, why don't we just start with you and go back in sequence. So can you talk a little bit about sort of, what we are broadly calling sort of non-traditional methods of creating or sharing sort of the scholarship and research that you do? And, thanks for the link and, any other resources that you want to drop in, because we do create a Google Doc that goes with these recorded videos where all the resources that have been shared are included on there.
Okay. I think for the work I do, I would say it's more along the creation of knowledge is, I guess, non-traditional. The sharing of knowledge that I do, I think, is still generally pretty traditional, papers and conferences and things like that. But the In terms of creation, I can give one example that's pretty recent, where I worked on a project where I was working with science museums in Arizona, trying to help them have a better understanding of how people who were visiting the museums were engaging with and understanding the material that they were seeing inside the museum. And so with some colleagues here at ASU, Judd Bowman's a professor of astronomy, and then Cassie Bowman works at ASU also and was the education director for the NASA Mars missions. So the three of us got together and designed a sort of a mobile app for visitors in science museums in the Arizona Science Center and then the Natural History Museum in Mesa. And it was a sort of a question and answer game app, basically, that groups of people who were going into the museums would get a hold of. And as they went through and were looking at things in the museum, they could ask our app anything about what they were seeing. And so it was beneficial for the visitors in that they were able to get more accurate information about what they were seeing because it was connected to a curated database that the museum experts themselves had put together about their exhibits. And it was useful for the museum personnel because we connected it to a visualization on the back end where every morning people who work at the museum could come in and see exactly what are people asking about our exhibits, what are they not understanding. We knew through the app sort of where they were spending the most time in the exhibits, where they were spending the least time in the exhibits. And so it helped docents and other volunteers in the museum be well prepared to interact in real time with the folks who were in the museum, and then also to have a better sort of overview of what people were understanding. So that's one way of creating knowledge, both for the folks in the museum who were working there and then also for the visitors, that was a little different than what they'd had experienced before. I got a bunch more, but that's one.
That's great, Brian. Thanks. Let's go to Keon. Keon, an example or two and some of these non-traditional methods, as we're calling them.
Sure. I was going to say we wanted, because I think we were going to go in reverse order. This is also my way to, so I can take a little bit more time, without adding with the Sherman goals.
That's fine.
Is that okay with you?
I'm fine with that. I'm totally fine with that. Thanks. Probably the thing that I've done most consistently across my career is blogging. I've had a professional blog since 2001, and it's like varied between slice of academic life with exploration of ideas that I wanted to put out there, but like weren't quite in the right form for other venues. So most recently in there, I wrote a 5-part series on what historical perspectives I could bring to thinking about education in the pandemic. And I put the link to the first part of that series in the chat. I've also written for general audiences during my sabbatical. I put a little bit of effort into that included some pieces in Slate, Washington Post's Made by History section, Zocalo Square. A couple of years before that, I placed a piece in the Arizona Republic. And that actually came out of, that led to a short interview on the Arizona PBS Verizon show about Sesame Street and Arizona and the Arizona connection. Leanna Archambault and Lauren Harris have also written for the Slate Future Tense section. The sort of the Arizona Republic piece in 2019 was about a moment when the co-founder of Children's Television Workshop was concerned about funding for Sesame Street and went to Barry Goldwater as one of the very political efforts to try to maintain some federal funding. Sesame Street's never been fully funded by the federal government, but it did have a significant amount of investment early on. I'm also going to put some other examples in the chat. Until recently, I had a fairly large presence on Twitter. I'm going to talk a little bit in chat about what some specific things connections to scholarship are and two failures. And then I'll pass it off to Keon.
I would just add too, folks, if you have questions, I forgot to remind you, please post them in chat as we're going along. I was just thinking as both Brian and Sherman were talking, I have questions like, how do you get something into the Arizona Republic? And Sherman, I know you've been exploring something called, I think, Substack for a new venue. So things like that. So anyway, folks, just encourage you to do that so we make sure to capture questions. All right, Keon, are you ready? Sorry for going out of order before.
Thanks, Betty. And Sherman, you're always so well prepared for everything, but even in like these moments, I'm like, now I want to hear about the failures with the notes, but we can come back to that. For me, actually, I'll credit and owe this to Dr. Mildred Boveda, who used to be our colleague here, who's at Penn State now, and we were talking once about methods, and she was sharing with me, she's like, you should write about community as methodology and how that shows up in your work. And I think part of my sharing of quote unquote non-traditional methods has been to some degree articulating things I've done pre-tenure and just now sharing them out loud post-tenure. We could talk about maybe some of the challenges with that. So how things such as love is very much rooted in my approach to methodology, how this notion of community is very much rooted and built into my approach to methodology. And I think all of the ways that I engage in what may fall under the broader moniker of kind of humanizing methods or methodologies that aren't written about within my method section, but are part of my ethical or political commitment to working with students. So it can be something as small as when I'm trying to recruit students to projects, I'll just set up one meeting, particularly if I'm on the campus where I'm collecting the data, and just give them an opportunity to meet them and let them know. I almost am trying to find a way that I can be a resource to them, and I tell them whether they're going to be a part of the project or not. So there's many students who I have ongoing relationships with who never participate in my research, but I understand that for many of them, I might be one of the few Black professors that they'll meet on this campus. And so I feel like there's a kind of obligation and reciprocity to show up in that particular way. But with the current project now, that focuses on Black men, undergraduate men's engagement with feminists, Black feminists and Black queer perspectives, and trying to understand how that informs our sense of masculinity. I've integrated more performance into that work. And I've also kind of haphazardly fumbled upon using more visual methods. So it started with me writing this letter to them that I shared. It resonated in one of our meetings. They wrote letters, and then I collaborated, and I owe Sherman this as well, suggesting to collaborate. I collaborated with a friend who did photos for my partner and I wedding, some family photos. And what we did was we took the letter and put it into creative visuals. And then I did audio over the letter. As some of you all know, I took a course this past summer on visual effects so I can learn how to edit the visual photos. And ultimately the goal is to have this displayed at like a museum hall where I'm collecting a number of letters from Black men. There will be these visual and audio performances. So I'll share really briefly just some of the photos so you can get a sense of what it is. So these are, my son is in some of these photos, and it's always good to show adorable kids, right? As Aisha is doing. So these are some of the photos, and then some of the effects that, this is an example of like one of the effects that I'm playing with that took me, 10 days, and I'm sure I could pay someone to do it in an hour. But this is also part of the learning with the work that I'm doing. So I'll stop there.
Thanks. Very cool. Love all the examples from everyone. We've got such a great group here with such diverse ways of thinking about knowledge generation and dissemination. So, so our next question or set of questions has to do with benefits. So we asked ahead of time everyone to think a bit about the most significant benefits from using these new methods that they personally or you personally experienced. It could be the audience you reach, different applications of your work, etc. So if you don't mind, Keon, we'll go back in reverse order. Would you care to kick us off with that? What were some of the benefits of this approach?
Absolutely. So I think the biggest benefit has been the audiences that I'm able to reach. And so I've shared the fuller video out with people and just hearing the stories that come back. So with this work around Black men, when people that I know share with other Black men and the conversations that they're able to have with these types of topics that never emerge out of, even if I'm doing a workshop or facilitating a conversation, certainly not from a research paper or a conference presentation. And then the kind of emotional register that it has, right? So stories of people crying, being deeply reflective and thoughtful, and that means a lot, right? And I've even sharing it with people who may know me and know the work that I do, but then being able to be invited into my life world in a different way. And so to me, that the way I've also described it is giving me an opportunity to be in community with folks who I've always wanted to be in community with related to my work, and in a way return home, right, into places of cultural familiarity and discuss and engage in my work and expand and learn from communities that I always wanted to, that in many ways, like I long to be a part of, and I hope my work registers with. So this is giving me an opportunity to do that.
Very cool. Yeah, it starts to make me think of all the limitations of our traditional venues. You know, we sort of bleach out all the emotion and all the personal connection and everything else from journal articles and academic publications. And no wonder we have trouble moving people with that work. Sherman, you're next.
Oh, wow. It's going to be hard to follow in Keon's footsteps, so that I have no pictures of adorable children. So let me talk a little bit about what I think I've learned from trying to do these things. First, I think it always makes me better at writing and communicating in general, because I have to think in different ways. In my blog in 2004 and 2005, I realized I was becoming a source about some education, higher ed policy debates in Florida that really weren't being covered very well at the time. So that made me think, okay, instead of like writing these long, bloviating essay or mini essays, I needed to keep anything about contemporary events short and pithy and clearly explained. And that was sort of a bit of a crucible. The other piece is in terms of working with editors of different types of publications. So working with editors from Slate or Zocalo Square or The Conversation gives a very, very different experience in terms of what their priorities are. And their advice is sometimes blunt. And I've tried to take that as a learning experience, even when I occasionally disagree with the advice. So that's like one very, very important benefit is pushing myself to be in a space where I have to think differently about how I communicate. Second benefit, and this is more about social media, Twitter put me in conversation with a very broad range of people, both inside and outside education research. Dana Boyd talked about, I think she's the person who coined the term context collapse. in connection with social media, where your sort of usual social boundaries can dissolve quite a bit, and you encounter people in very different contexts. And for about 10 years, that was a great way to make connections. That has unfortunately largely collapsed in the past half year, and I've spent very little time on Twitter recently, but it was a real benefit for a number of years. And then in Florida, by about 2005, 2006, I was probably the only academic writing publicly on a regular basis about state education policy, and it became a common source for education reporters. And that actually turned into a really important experience later when I became the head of my campus's faculty union, when I had to learn not only how to respond to reporters, but how to respond occasionally in such a boring way that the story would actually never be printed. But that was that's a bit of an arcane thing.
Thank you, Sherman, for that. And just a couple of points to follow before Brian call you back. So one is, and Liana is on the call as well. So she and I have talked about how when you're writing for something like Slate, where the editors actually go in and change your prose, which is something as academics we are not used to at all. We are used to getting reviewers and then we tweak the language. And that is a very interesting. So Liana, I don't know if you want to speak to that. And then I want to also comment a little bit about blogging from my side. But Liana, why don't you, since we are on that topic?
Well, I think it's just a different perspective from the editor. I think even the title, the teachers pay teachers, they said, they just flat out in the title said teachers pay teachers has a racism problem, like that, like to gain clicks, right? Like, which is they want eyes on and I was just like, oh, I wouldn't have necessarily put it that way, but then I see the value in just calling it out. But yeah, I had never had an article marked up quite. It just completely, it was a completely different style of writing. So you have to kind of check your ego at the door and realize that this is a learning opportunity.
And I think, Liana, you had mentioned to me this issue also of the level of fact checking, which is always very impressive to me. I was recently working with the TED organization, and the extent to which they fact checked literally every sentence of what I was going to say. They tracked down my website articles and they said, do you mean this here you said the following over there, but in your talk you're saying something else? That was a very interesting, that was actually a very humbling and a very good experience. And I think you had also similar things with the teachers paying teachers piece, right? Yeah.
Well, we had to reach out for a comment. And so you're not necessarily, when you're writing in the academic space, you're able to be critical and not necessarily, but that process of having to give the other side of the story and reach out for comment, and then teachers pay teachers wanted to meet with us, and it kind of blew up, and I wasn't expecting it. But the editor was very helpful in managing that, and it was like, no, we're not meeting with you. Here's the claim. Do you have a comment or not? And they ended up not having anyway, it was just an interesting process to be a part of.
Yeah, and I think that also speaks to sort of the different rules of the discourse communities within which we exist, with academia and public, writing for something like Slate just is different. So I also wanted to talk briefly, just following Sherman, because I have been blogging for 15 years and it's been transformational. I have felt that my career would not have been the same if I hadn't been writing publicly. And I really, and I write in this piece, this was a blog post I wrote because I celebrated 15 years of doing this January. And I realized that, it's become such a sort of a quasi-public space for me to think. So it's much more, I'm really writing mostly for myself at some level. And I share the link with some friends and colleagues, but that's pretty much it. I've not ever pursued getting a subscription or people signing up to get emails or anything, but it has made me a much better writer because I'm writing for this sort of fictional person in my head who is an interested layman. I think, what's his name? Richard Dawkins, in one of his books, he writes about who is he writing for. He says, I'm writing for the lawyer or the businessman who's sitting next to me in an airplane, who is curious and interested about the world, but doesn't know my field. And so that writing for that imaginary person, I think, has made me a much better writer, because you're consistently sort of thinking about how to explain complex ideas simply. And that's a really very powerful and important thing. And I just wanted to share that that blog post that I wrote about what I have learned over these 15 years. And it's a lot of effort. It takes time, but it's also paid back. Now, maybe not in as literal ways as Sherman's has, I think, where I think, Sherman, I've been following you for a while, and I've really appreciated like how you very thoughtfully blog. And I've always been impressed by your Twitter presence, how you engage with it. I never mastered that one, never figured that out. So Betty, I mean, I just wanted to put those little comments in there about my personal experience with this as well.
That's great. Yeah. And now I think, Brian, we'll turn to you.
Yeah, and this is so focusing back again on the sort of alternative ways of creating knowledge. The main benefits, and the reason I got into it initially, was a dissatisfaction with the status quo in terms of how kids were experiencing science in schools. So I focus a lot on STEM, right? And there's a lot of good work being done in how kids learn STEM, but there were a whole bunch of kids who were being missed in the experiences that they were having in schools. And so through the projects that I've worked on, it was really looking at how can we do a better job of more equitably providing experiences for all the kids that we have in our classes. So as an example, I did a project called Save Science, which is a terrible name, but it's the idea of Save Science was the standard science assessments that kids were getting worked pretty well for a small subset of the students, but we really needed to explore alternative ways to understand what kids were knowing and give them opportunities to demonstrate what they were learning. So with some colleagues at University of Maryland, we created essentially a series of assessments that were video games or situated adventure games through which kids in middle school they'd have their sort of regular old lessons in class with their teacher. And then rather than taking a standardized test, they would go into our adventure games and have an opportunity to practice and demonstrate what they had learned in the class. And one of the main benefits we found was that, kids who do well on standardized tests, they did well in our game too, but kids who didn't do well on a standardized test were actually able to display a real strong understanding of what they had been learning in class by giving them different ways to go about doing it, situating it, the knowledge that they had gained in the class in sort of real world, realistic opportunities to practice and show what they had learned. So I would say that's the biggest benefit of things like games, virtual environments, and things for the creation of knowledge on kids' parts is that it's reaching more of them.
Great, Brian. Great example. Obviously close to my heart with the game-based approach. I was just curious if you'd include Port of Mars in the kind of different projects or different ways of creating knowledge that you've been involved with. That was an interesting.
Yeah, it's another example of an alternative, and that was really focused on sort of it was how do teams coordinate really challenging situations in which there are limited resources. And so it was yet another example of that approach to getting people to understand a complex and complicated sort of system of decision making through the use of games. And it had similar features. It was situated, and it was a sort of an adventure game that we created. So it's still going on, by the way, at ASU.
I think I saw something about it now being a digital game and publicly available. So people.
Yes, I'm not on the newest version of it, but yeah, now they've started. They're doing like a Mars Madness, a sort of a March Madness sort of tournament that they had created, and with a digital version of Tour de Mars that people can play.
Cool. Okay. Well, I could go on down a rabbit hole with game-based approaches here, but I just put the link. This is a link to the game in the chat. So, so we also wanted to switch, and before we open it up for general questions, just have our discussants share one of the challenges, one or two of the things that they found the most challenging or whatever about using these methods. You know, I'm sure some of these took, you know, required a significant learning curve to be able to become fluent with it. Keon referred to that. Another one would be getting support or recognition for your work from peers or from others. So, so yeah, and I guess we'll go backward. Brian, would you like to kick us off with that one?
So challenges. A couple of major challenges in doing this, the kind of work that I have been doing is, one is getting people to take it seriously. When you start talking about video games, immediately some folks will say that's not a real thing and that we should be focused on. That has become less of an issue for sure over the past decade. But it continues to play out to some extent. If I'm going into schools and working with teachers on implementing games or simulations, it's often ends up being done sort of as an extra or an added thing rather than trying to think about how it can be incorporated into the sort of real world of the school. So that's one challenge. Another one, especially around assessments, I'll connect to yet another project, which was called 21st Century Assessment that Jim G ran with a big group of co-PIs, and I was one of them. And a big part of the discussion we were trying to find far better ways to do alternative forms of assessment for learning, such as the Safe Science Project. And the challenge there was, again, one is to get people to take it seriously, that there could be better ways making use of immersive technologies to understand how people are learning and let them demonstrate their learning. And another challenge is how do you prove it? The typical way to prove that an assessment in a game works is to compare that assessment to a standardized test. But if we're claiming that standardized tests are often not very good, that tend to focus on language, sort of surface level knowledge rather than sort of deep understanding, and you show that some game that you've designed does as well, that's not a good thing necessarily. And so that's a real challenge. I will say Jim G argued for overthrowing the whole system, which I like, but I don't know how likely that is. So those are a couple of challenges.
Thanks, Brian. Sherman, challenges.
Yeah. So, Betty, you talked about learning curves, and I think it's probably good to think about every new way of communicating has two different learning curves. There's the technical learning curve. So, Keon has visual editing skills, and I know way too much about WordPress's cascading style sheets. But it's the second issue, the strategic learning curve, that can be more interesting. And here I want to go back to something that you referenced at the beginning of the hour about the changes in the standards of academia that's directly relevant to the second question. As a faculty, we just approved a change, a whole bunch of changes in the standards of academia, but one thing that we did was to broaden what was already a pretty ecumenical set of evidence for scholarship. In particular, assuming that the provost's office approves the new language, it talks about collections or packages of materials being valuable evidence and possibly more important than journal articles in themselves. I've just put the relevant language and it's in the section on academic leadership and scholarship. Now, the most obvious example of this connected set of publications and media might be for someone who does classroom research, and you have a article or set of articles in research journal, and then a logically related set of pieces in practitioner journals. But it also could be a research article or articles having partners of policy briefs, op-eds, podcasts, and the language, the new language and the standards of academia makes it clear it's in our power as individual faculty to say in a personal statement something like, the following 5 pieces use the same project and reach different audiences for different types of impact, and I consider them my collective dissemination for this project. I think that's the type of language that would sort of trigger this, thing, are to be evaluated as a collection. That's an important change that I hope we take advantage of. So I want to make that pitch. Now, the strategic value of these different ways of communicating can change over one's career. Case in point for me, Twitter. I invested a lot of time in Twitter and thinking about how to use it, and I don't regret that. But I'm not really spending effort right now trying to think, what might I do with Twitter in the future? I'm thinking about other sort of things. So for about 4 years, I've been working with a fellow historian with a project on where she does a history of Sesame Street and sound. And we've been collecting interviews to produce a short podcast series on the history of Sesame Street. It's got wrapped up in the pandemic, and we don't have all of the technical skills. And so we've been trying to pull in various things and, but that's an example of something I didn't expect to do until I just I was going to be on a panel with her, and I, in email to everybody, I said, and I might be interested in doing a podcast on Sesame Street or something like that. And she picked up on that and contacted me. And so we've had a lovely time interviewing people like Bob McGrath, Lloyd Morissette, who's one of the co-founders of Children's Television Workshop, and a whole lot of other people. Or more recently, I've been thinking about Substack, which is something I mentioned. The technical learning curve for that is really flat and short. I think it's just going to be like a, click a button and start writing type of thing. But the strategic learning curve is not, especially because places like Substack or Medium or other sort of existing commercial platforms have politics to them and social context to them, just like Twitter does and Facebook does. I'm concerned, having seen Substack and who dominates the space right now and how its owners are thinking, or more so, what they're not thinking in terms of the potential for it to become an online cesspool in some dimensions, which all large social media can do. And I'm currently thinking about it. How could I use it to diversify the voices people would encounter in Substack when they read about education? So could I do emails of interviews with colleagues? Could I highlight, instead of burying at the bottom of the post, highlight pointers to published pieces like in the Washington Post Made by History section, and then pull in content from my blog, polish it a little bit. But the stuff that I write would not be the major point. But that's the type of thinking that I think it's a learning curve that is not the technical learning curve, but it's just as important because when we're out in public, there are some interesting things that can happen and can't always control it. But you should at least think about, okay, well, what could I use it for? What are the things that I can predict are going to be things I really want to think about deeply now?
Thanks, Sherman. Yeah, really, really interesting points. I keep thinking about this idea that you can't use a tool or a form of media without understanding the social and cultural context and, kind of all of that around it and what's going to happen as a result. Keon, we'll move to you.
So first, I'll say I agree with all that's been said, and I actually wanted to revisit the last question, and as a way to enter into this one, and hope and say something a little bit different, but it's still related. So I really appreciate, Brian, your point about the creation of knowledge. And I think that's been probably one of the biggest benefits epistemologically with my work, is how do I know a particular topic? And I think it's opened up a much more creative engagement that also creates more opportunities for participation from those who are usually shut out from knowledge creation and production in an interdisciplinary and more collaborative way. And so that has been incredibly helpful. At the same time, I think while that has been personally rewarding and engaging and I think broadened its participation, to me, the biggest challenge probably has been my own type of wrestling and unlearning with my socialization around what constitutes rigorous research, but then also thinking strategically at what points, as someone who's relatively newly with tenure, at what points is it strategic to lead with certain forms of methodological work and not. And I think it's I look at both, even my dissertation co-chairs. So one, my advisor in higher education, who I always say used critical theories, but probably he's more post-positivist methodologies, right? He's a qualitative worker who interviews 200 students for 2 or 3 hours at a time. So he does these like massive qualitative projects, and that's a form of, I think, establishing legitimacy and the evidence that he puts forward. My co-chair, who's in communications, anthropology, and Africana studies, will be the new provost at Penn. He always wrote the traditional books, but he was also a documentary filmmaker. So his approach was to do both at the same time, but he also showed, how hard it was to do both. And I think for me, that's been one of my challenges, is always having an interest in doing this work. Been doing it in some ways, but not always putting it at the forefront. So, and part of that is related to, I would say, how I want to be received. So, thinking about my own positionality, I joked that I was interviewing a student the other day for a project, and they told me that I looked their age, and I was like, that's fair, right? And I was like, so I'm young. I entered the academy young, and I look younger than what I am. As a Black scholar, doing work around, when I start saying things like white supremacy or heteronormativity and patriarchy, sometimes that lands in different ways depending on the rooms that I'm in. So early on, one of the ways that I maintained, I think, legibility as a quote unquote rigorous scholar was to write in that my genre of writing, my methods always seem rigorous, right? And it seemed like, okay, this person has the chops to do quote unquote hardcore quality research. And I think for me, that was both a personal kind of calculation about how I want my work to be received in the academy, but it was also thinking about students that I write letters for, right, and mentor, or other opportunities that I might be able to support others in getting if I'm received as being a credible, rigorous scholar who also does this type of work. So there's been, the kind of, for me, it's been the work of quieting those like nagging voices, right? For me to enjoy what's been largely benefits and opportunities for doing work in a different way.
Thanks so much, Keon. I really appreciate the reflection. Yeah, Punya?
Iveta, I was sort of side channeling Iveta if she wanted to speak to some of the work that she's been doing. And she was very interested in following up with what Keon said about, about what is quote unquote real research. So I know, Iveta, I wouldn't say dabble, you've been deeply engaged with some of these alternative forms and thinking really hard about what research is and what its implications are for the real world. So would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I'll just chime in really quickly, but it's so inspiring to hear all of the ideas and ways of trying to figure out the best way to engage with our audiences, but also do the research that's meaningful, right? And so I have been also in very kind of similar ways also trying to push some boundaries of what research is or what's considered to be quote unquote real research. And it's really fascinating. And so for me, this was actually going into the space of doing research with childhood memories, but drawing on our own childhood memories, right? And it was a really difficult shift to make about 10 years ago when we started working with this work, right? And we engaged in it from the perspective of collective biography, and really tried to deepen this work and connect it to other areas of research. But it started very personally, because a lot of the works that we have been reading about, in this particular case, post-socialist childhoods, did not really make much sense to us who lived those very childhoods, right? And at one point we basically thought, why is it always somebody else who writes about us, right? And why can't we authorize ourselves to talk on our own behalf? And that, of course, kind of challenges all kinds of established research boundaries, right? Because all the textbooks teach, a lot of textbooks, mainstream textbooks teach you about how you have to be separate from your research subjects, right? And the further you are separated, the more objective you are. So anyways, it actually took it was a challenging process to feel comfortable with authorizing ourselves to talk on our own behalf, and then figuring out how we can write about it in such a way that still maintains authority, and that's still that the others would perceive it in a way, would perceive it as basically real and legitimate research. And we experimented with it quite a bit, but I think that collective approach helped a lot too, not only to build our own confidence, but also engage more and more people who could also speak from the same perspective, right? Or maybe draw connection to the research that they have been doing. And of course, we ended up connecting a lot to also decolonial scholarship and, memory work in that way as well. But it's really difficult, right, to go against the mainstream, but also super liberating once you begin doing it. And, suddenly the work just seems to be so much more meaningful. And you can also see the students, how excited they are kind of also when they see that such spaces are possible. So I think that was very interesting too. But it is a little bit like going up the hill or against the stream, for sure.
Any questions or comments from anyone else here? We've been kind of alternating asking questions and getting answers from our discussants. Anyone else have a question they'd like to ask, or an example, or something they're working with or working on?
I can jump in with a quick comment. So this is relevant to the point Sherman, and I'm sorry I missed a part of it. I'm doing this workshop with Center for Science and the Imagination, and they keep pulling me in and out for different things. So, so I just, decided to learn how to podcast, and $15 a month got me a Simplecast account. And it's been an interesting learning curve, trying to figure that out. But it's like, yeah, $15 a month, it's fine. I can try that. And chances are it won't go very far, and that's okay too. But I think part of it is that, I'm always wanting to learn about new media, new ways of, and like Sherman said, some of them work and some of them don't. So I'm very keen about this new medium of podcasting, and trying to figure out what it means to have sort of genuine conversations within that space. And then, of course, the whole technical aspects of figuring out how to edit and put it up, upload it, and all that kind of fun stuff.
Let me sort of pose an interesting, okay. The thought that runs through my head is Keon, Brian, and I have been talking about, for the most part, sort of things that we have been doing and taking the initiative of. And Yvette, you were talking about more collective, collaborative approach. And Leanna, your piece for Slate, Future Tense, came out of the article that you and your co-authors wrote that was for a research journal. And I'm wondering, and maybe this is something to think about the Learning Futures collaboratives that the college has, what would it look like to build in outreach to a larger collaborative project at the start? Because my experience has been sort of these things as add-ons or as sort of a more persistent infrastructure that I built for myself with the blog. And I'm just like trying to think about what sort of things might we want to think about at the outset of projects that might make this possible, or what are sort of the types of essential questions that we may want to ask about who are we doing this for? And I don't have any answers to that.
So Sherman, I can
a really quick thought, because I work a lot with Canadian colleagues, and in Canada, like for the SHRC, which is a Canadian equivalent of the NSF, one of the core categories is knowledge mobilization, and under the knowledge mobilization, like all of that dissemination kind of strategies should be considered, right? Including whether it's podcasting or blogging or research output, right? Or whatnot. And kind of their idea is in this knowledge mobilization literature is that that's some things that you have to think from the very beginning of research. And you have to basically, from the very beginning of research, work with the stakeholders that will be involved in your research in one way or another, right? To figure out what the best strategies are to reach the different audiences. So it's really different way of thinking. And it's interesting. So in Canada, it's already, they're trying to mainstream it from the very beginning of proposal writing, but we are definitely not doing this at all.
So a couple of quick thoughts to follow up on that. And Sherman, thanks for bringing that up. So one is, Gustavo has always been a big advocate for knowledge mobilization, exactly as the forma beta that you described. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that we did with the LFCs is, the infrastructure that we built before the LFCs even started, which was like the Learning Futures podcasts, which then allow the LFCs to become part of that podcast setup, right? So you've been a guest on this. All the other LFCs have had particular episodes devoted to that. So that's one piece. The other piece that I want to sort of highlight, which is sort of work in progress, and this is a conversation with Juliana Carson and team, about thinking of, can we build sort of prose and infrastructure sort of related pieces so that when you are applying for a grant, you don't have to sort of make this up from whole cloth, that you can have prose and what the sort of corresponding costs are if you want to have a blog, if you want to have a website, if you want to have a podcast or a webinar, that would automatically be sort of built into the process so that you can take that prose, adapt it for your needs and dump it and drop it in your proposal. Sort of getting at that, we can be sort of more preemptive and intentional about it. So I don't know, Juliana, if you want to, sort of briefly talk about that, the conversation that we've been having around that.
Yeah, well, it's a broad conversation. So if there's specific questions about it, please, unmute yourselves and feel free to ask. It's a broad topic. So we've had a lot of changes in the last 3 years, and now we're seeing regulatory changes. So things like open data is becoming more appealing in a little bit of a different way to the federal government. And NABOR is trying to be compliant, and NIH and these different agencies are kind of saying, well, we want to see the raw data sets that you work from for many reasons. In research, probably one of the primary ones is, is it replicable? Can we recreate what you say you found from that data? And so where is that data? Is it public? Is it not? And it's created all other kinds of issues like IP, scrubbing, and is there sensitive HIPAA information being put out there, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's kind of this huge broad picture that, and we're not really seeing a lot of funding going towards that yet, though. Where's the money? How do we pay for servers? How do we pay for security, cybersecurity, et cetera, hosting? But in that kind of thinking of open data, open, not necessarily source, but things being available and kind of opening the gates a little bit in academia. And there's other things happening in the divisions where Gina Connor was leading, I think it was professional learning. I think I'm saying that right, professional learning library. how do we utilize a tool and create a tool that is for multiple stakeholders and audiences in kind of one tool. So if you're a researcher and you've just had wrapped up a $4 million grant, and it was with a sponsor agency that said, yes, open data is fine, or, however you want to publish that information. If you want to make modules publicly available, go for it. We're the resources in our college to really do that. In a centralized location that has utility and purpose, but is already kind of reaching these different audiences and will be used. And not just on a server somewhere that gathers dust, and maybe one cohort or for a year, folks are aware of it, and then it fades away. And then after a while, it becomes a budget line item where someone says, why are we paying $100 for this website? And it's gone. So really trying to see, it's like, and that from a grant perspective, that concept of a library like that also answers like the sustainability and impact. Because now you're saying we have something that is sustainable or longer term, or at least it's bigger than itself. If we start bringing in multiple sets of knowledge and outcomes from different grants, projects for different uses. But Punya, the conversation has been broad and it has many applications. So if there's specific questions, let me know.
Of course. Thank you. Thank you. So Betty, it looks like we are at the end of our hour.
I know. Once again, it's flown by. So thank you so much to our discussants and everyone else who's participated. This was a discussion, I think, that prompted even more ideas for things that we might want to do in the future to help share the knowledge that a lot of you are developing about these alternative ways of creating and sharing knowledge, and thinking more expansively too in terms of how we recognize and value that in the college. So yeah, that was a takeaway for me. Punya.
Well, this is the last episode of Just an Hour for this year. We will be back in fall for sure, but just want to thank all of you for joining in regularly. Some of you every episode. That is awesome. When Claren and Betty and I were sort of discussing what we should be doing, one of the things we felt was that we do not often have opportunities to talk about ideas in our college. Everybody's busy. And so when we hit on the name Just an Hour, we got very excited by it, because it's like, yeah, can we find just an hour every week? And so appreciative of all of you to give that hour to the intellectual sort of work and explorations that we do. So with that, we'll wish you all a wonderful end of the semester, and see you at graduation, and you know where to find us. So yeah, have a good one.